So now we're going to talk about reducing the sources of greenhouse gas pollution. I already told you that this is going to be key to addressing climate change. We're going to stop the problem before it even gets into the atmosphere. And that's the way we need to begin. So we're going to zoom in and look at all the different contributors to the sources of greenhouse gas pollution, and how we can bring these things down to zero and stop the problem at its tracks. Well, what are the sources of this greenhouse gas pollution to begin with? Well, you've heard of a few of them, but some of them are going to be kind of surprising. One of the places we should begin is the biggest emitting sector of greenhouse gases, which is making electricity. It turns out that burning coal in a power plant or natural gas creates carbon dioxide, and that is a big contributor to climate change. Overall, across the world, it's about 1/4 of the problem. In some countries it's bigger, in some countries it's smaller, but the globe as a whole is 25%. The next biggest source of greenhouse gases often surprises people, and it's 24%, is food. It turns out that growing food and agriculture and the land use associated with all of that together is about 24% of our emissions. Isn't that weird that electricity and food are about equal and together are half of climate change? We hear a lot more about the electricity space, though, than we do the food space. It turns out they're about equally important. Then we switch over to industry, kind of making all the stuff in the world. We'll go through a lot of those different things, but making steel and cements and plastics and other things, as well as managing waste, is what's happening here, and that's 21% of the problem. Then we've got transportation, moving us and our goods around the planet, whether it's a car, a truck, a plane, a ship, and whatever. That's about 14% of the problem. Then we go to buildings. Buildings cause about 6% of climate change. But to be fair, buildings also are using a lot of the electricity. They're responsible for some of the industrial emissions to make the components of buildings. And of course, transportation takes us from building to building. So buildings directly, from their furnaces, their hot water heaters, boilers, and air conditioners, emit greenhouse gases, but they have a big effect on a lot of the other sectors. So how we build buildings and what we do with buildings and the design of cities is crucial throughout all of those wedges of our pie chart. Then we've got the remaining 10%. That's a lot of different things, but it's actually dominated by the energy industry. It's going to be responsible for things like fugitive emissions, the kind of leaks of methane and natural gas that aren't intentional, or when they flare off natural gas in an oil well, or the emissions when we refine crude oil into things we use like diesel fuel, gasoline, and so on. So energy industry and a few other things show up in that last 10%. But look at the first 5. It's kind of amazing that only 5 things, electricity, food, industry, transportation, and buildings, cause 90% of climate change. Well, heck, that's just one hand. We can solve 90% of the problems with just this. That's pretty good. So let's go through each of these sectors and kind of see what can we do to reduce these emissions and eventually bring them down to zero. So we're going to look at each sector, and then we're going to dive into particular solutions. And we're going to show you how at Project Drawdown, we've tried to estimate the size of these different solutions and which ones might work best. So let's start with electricity. Electricity, again, produces about 1/4 of the world's greenhouse gases. And the production of electricity burning fossil fuels, especially coal and natural gas, causes those emissions. But we can also look at how electricity is used. Most of the world's electricity is used in buildings, for lighting and air conditioning, heating, refrigeration, all those kinds of things. And about the other half or so is used in industry, making stuff, big industrial, big machine processes. The rest is about 2%, that's used in food and transportation and everything else. So buildings and industry are the big users. Well, let's make this kind of real. Burning coal and natural gas in a power plant is what produces these emissions, and that's what makes electricity, and sometimes we use the heat in a power plant for something else as well. We take that electricity, we put it in buildings, industry, and everywhere else. And the kind of electricity we make is associated with the electricity that's in the grid, but also the greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere. For example, burning coal releases about 2 pounds of CO2 for every kilowatt hour of electricity we use. Natural gas is a little less. It's more like 1.2 pounds of CO2 for every kilowatt hour we produce. Then we have solar, wind, nuclear, and other forms of making electricity that don't produce any CO2. So this is a big difference between the fossil fuels electricity and the non-fossil fuel electricity. It's a huge, huge difference. Now let's make this real. A kilowatt hour is what we use to measure electricity consumption. A kilowatt hour is like using 1,000 watts for 1 hour. A hairdryer uses about 1,000 watts. So if you turned on a hairdryer and left it there for an hour, that's 1 kilowatt hour of electrical use. Pretty simple. Well, the average American home uses 1,000 kilowatt hours every month, on average. Some use more, some use less, for all the different things we use electricity for. Well, if we do the math, 1,000 kilowatt hours on America's electrical grids, which releases on average about 1.4 pounds of CO2 for every kilowatt hour, that means an average American home is responsible for over 16,000 pounds of CO2 pollution, or over 8 tons. That's incredible. How would we reduce that? Well, we already kind of know, don't we? We can have energy efficiency. We could reduce the use of electricity. No matter how the electricity is made, we could probably cut it in half with better lighting, better air conditioners, better appliances, and so on. But then we can also switch the way we make electricity to things like renewables that don't emit any CO2 at all. So that 1-2 punch of efficiency and transforming to renewables is key here. While Drawdown, we looked at those solutions not at your home level, but at the larger economy level, at the whole planet. And we looked at a whole bunch of solutions that could enhance efficiency, many of which are in buildings and automation, and are all listed here. And we also looked at ways we can shift electricity production away from coal and gas to things like solar and wind, hydro, geothermal, biomass, nuclear, and beyond. We also have to do a few other things, by the way, like improving the grid. We have to have electricity dispatched and stored in new ways to accommodate renewables. And we also have to have more flexibility in how electricity is used. But if we put all these things together, a whole bunch of efficiency solutions, a whole bunch of solutions about producing energy in new ways, and improving the grid, we have an enormous suite of climate solutions right here in electricity. In this picture, each of those solutions is represented by a single circle. The bigger the circle, the bigger the climate solution. Some of those circles actually have 2 rings, an inner one and an outer one, and that kind of represents a range of estimates we've made about how big that solution could be over the next 30 years or so. So there are a lot of good solutions here in efficiency and making electricity in new ways. Really exciting. Let's look at food. Food's also a big emitter of greenhouse gases. Again, about a quarter, 24% of our emissions come from food. A lot of folks, though, think the food emissions come from things like moving food around or food miles you might hear about, or if we grow food maybe organically or with conventional ag or GMOs. We talk about that stuff all the time, but it turns out those aren't the big issues. The really big issues in agriculture emissions for climate change are actually 3 other things. They're deforestation, kind of burning down forest for new agricultural land. Most of the deforestation on the planet today is happening in Brazil and Indonesia and a few other countries. In Brazil and Indonesia, we're clearing a lot of land for cattle and soybeans that are used to feed animals, mostly in Brazil. So animal agriculture is hugely responsible for deforestation there. In Indonesia, it's mostly for palm oil, being used as a cooking oil, mainly in China and India, but also used as kind of an ingredient in a lot of other foods. The next big area is methane from our animals and a little bit from rice fields. And again, animal agriculture is really important here because cattle and cows burp methane, as we talked about before, and that methane builds up in the atmosphere, causing a big level of new climate change. Basically, we're going to have to rethink meat and dairy products in order to reduce those emissions, either having a lot less of it or growing it in really different ways. Then we have nitrous oxide, that gas I talked about before, which is often produced by using fertilizer too much. Whether that's fertilizer that's chemical fertilizer or manure, they both have nitrogen in them. And if we put too much on a field under certain conditions, that nitrogen can come off into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, a major greenhouse gas. A lot of the rest, by the way, will run off into the water and cause pollution in streams and watersheds and lakes and even entire oceans. So managing nitrogen and fertilizers is going to be a real big problem, both for climate change, but also for ecosystems and our water. So to solve those problems, we can again look for efficiencies, things we can do to reduce the pressure on the food system. It turns out the biggest place to start is food waste, because we throw away about 1/3 of the food grown on the planet. Food waste is so crazy. In rich countries, we use far too much food and throw away a lot of it, and it's never even eaten, and that's just tragic. In poor countries, though, food waste is often about the same number, but it happens closer to the farmer, because maybe the crop didn't get to the marketplace. Maybe it rotted in storage, or it never got on the truck, or the train broke down. So we lose food there too, and the farmer loses their income. Kind of a double tragedy. So food waste is actually a huge problem, not only for climate change, but food security and a lot of other things. It's a problem worth solving. We also have to think about diets. I showed you how meat and dairy products were responsible for a lot of the big drivers of these emissions. So eating more plants and less meat-based products is a really simple, kind of easy, thing to do. If meat and dairy are responsible for a lot of emissions, let's eat a little less of that stuff and then grow what we do eat better. We also have to protect ecosystems from being cleared. Can we put up big fences and just say no to deforestation, stop them in their tracks? Make sure we don't clear forest, and especially forest with peatlands under them that have carbon in the trees, but carbon in the peat below ground. But then finally, we can also improve the way we farm on the lands we still are farming. That's going to be a whole bunch of different things, about using water better and nutrients better, tilling the soil less, putting on cover crops, all sorts of things. And you'll hear a lot of excitement about regenerative agriculture, which kind of mimics nature's way of doing things as we farm. Regenerative agriculture and these other farming practices can reduce emissions a lot, and that's really crucial. Later, we're going to talk about the potential of some of those farming techniques to not only reduce pollution, but also create new carbon sinks that might absorb CO2 and put it into the soil. That's pretty cool too. But for now, we're just talking about reducing the emissions from farms. Well, let's put all this together. It turns out by looking at all the food solutions, we see food waste is huge. Changing our diets can be huge. Protecting ecosystems, especially forest and forest with peatlands below them, are really important. And farming differently is a major contributor too. So the solutions to the food system climate problem are partly due to us, partly things about ecosystems, and partly what's happening on the farms. We can all do our part here. Well, then let's flip to industry. In industry, we make a whole bunch of things that take high temperature, very intensive processes to make, like metals, especially steel. Steel is a big contributor to climate change. Cement. Making cement releases a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. Our chemicals, and also plastics, things like that, each make some CO2 as well. By the way, we hear a lot about plastic being a big climate problem. It is. It's about 1.5% of climate change is tied to producing, using, and disposing of all the world's plastic. Definitely a problem, but it's even more of a problem out in the larger environment because it's affecting marine ecosystems and causing pollution all sorts of other places too. And then finally, managing waste. And the gases used in managing waste, but also released from landfills, is crucial. We're going to look at that too. So we're going to look at all sorts of industrial processes, manufacturing and materials, and how we process and manage waste across all of those different domains. At Drawdown, we've looked at a few already and put numbers on them, like what can we do with cement, what can we do with plastics, and then we look at a specific suite of chemicals called refrigerants, which are all these fluorinated gases. It turns out that fluorinated gases like chlorofluorocarbons are very dangerous. Back in the 70s, we realized that chlorofluorocarbons were actually hurting the ozone layer way up in the upper atmosphere. They also contributed to global warming. But we phased out most of those chlorofluorocarbons and replaced them with hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. Those don't hurt the ozone layer, thank goodness, but they still contribute to climate change. So they're ozone friendly, but not climate friendly. We're going to probably have to replace them again and replace them with climate friendly refrigerants and make sure that none of the existing refrigerants leak and get into the atmosphere. We've also looked at ways we can use waste as a resource. Rather than throwing something away and never using it again, the kind of recycling, repurposing, and actually using energy from our waste streams is a really clever idea, which makes just all sorts of sense. So if we think about improving materials, especially refrigerants, and using waste as a resource, we have a lot of solutions already appearing in the industrial sector. We've got a few more to work on, especially steel and a few other things, but we've got a good start here. Then we got transportation. Transportation is about 14% of the problem. Most of that is on road transportation. 10 of that 14% is in roads, cars, trucks, things like that. The flying we do, aviation, is a little less than 2%. That's all the commercial and military aviation on the planet is about 1.8% of global emissions. Everything else is another 2% or so. That's going to be ships and trains and other things. But mainly it's roads, planes, and the rest. CO2 is made here, that's pretty clear, by burning the fuels we use in transportation. Gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel. When we burn these liquid fuels, it releases carbon dioxide into the air. Well, let's take this to everyday life. Like, imagine a gallon of gasoline. You pick up a gallon of water, it weighs about 8 pounds. Gasoline's a little bit lighter, call it 7 pounds. If you burn a gallon of gasoline, which is mostly made up of carbon, and you add oxygen to it, 2 atoms of oxygen for every one of those carbon atoms, that 7 pounds becomes 20 pounds of pollution. And that 20 pounds of pollution goes into the atmosphere, right out of your tailpipe, and goes into the air and stays there for centuries, long after you're dead. Can you imagine that? Just burning 1 gallon of gas releases 20 pounds of pollution that could be up there for 1,000 years, maybe? That's incredible. So it turns out driving the average American car, which gets about 25 miles per gallon, driven about 15,000 miles a year, produces almost 12,000 pounds of CO2 pollution, which will last for centuries. That's about 6 tons of pollution. It's more than your car weighs, is what we put in the sky by a big margin. Fuel efficiency is crucial, though. If we go from 25 miles per gallon, which is crazy low, to 50, which is just kind of modest at this day and age, we can actually take that 12,000 pounds and bring it down to something like 5,000 to 6,000 pounds. That's a good step. Planes, again, use about 1.8% of the problem here, and that's caused by just burning aviation fuel in those planes, releasing CO2 as well. But we're getting a little bit more efficient in aviation. Today's planes use about 50 to 60 miles per gallon equivalent for every passenger on the plane. It'd be like driving a hybrid car, but the problem is you're going a lot of distance really fast and you can keep doing it. So when we think about transportation, we can look at efficiency, making the current things more efficient, like fuel efficiency in cars, more efficient airplanes, more efficient trucks, and so on. And we can also look for alternatives to fossil fuel transportation, like walking, bicycling, mass transit, or video conferencing, where you don't have to go anywhere to hear other ideas or meet other people. They're all really great. And then we can switch from a liquid kind of hydrocarbon fossil fueled vehicle to an electric vehicle. Electric cars are here to stay. They're better. They're going to be cheaper. They're going to be fun and useful and cheaper to operate. We're getting electric trains, of course, electric trucks, and other things. This is really crucial. But putting this all together, efficiency of our current vehicles, shifting to other ways of getting around, and then electrifying our new vehicles, there are a lot of great solutions to transportation. Okay, let's get to buildings. They emit directly about 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. But again, they're affecting electricity, transportation, and other areas as well. But what buildings emit directly within their building envelope are primarily from residential buildings. About 2 to 1 of these emissions are from homes and apartments compared to public and commercial buildings. So we're talking a lot about homes, apartments, as well as big public buildings too. Well, we emit greenhouse gases directly from buildings in our furnaces and boilers and hot water heaters, because they're going to burn natural gas or maybe fuel oil, heating oil, things like that. And those emit CO2 right from your basement. But buildings can also release refrigerants from air conditioners and refrigerators kind of accidentally if there are any leaks in your air conditioning equipment or your refrigerators and your freezers. That's why we always should be tuning those up and watching them. In a typical American home, we actually use a lot of natural gas to heat our spaces, especially in a cold place like Minnesota, where I live. or to heat our hot water for taking showers and things like that. And we measure natural gas in what are called therms. A therm is 100,000 BTUs worth of heat. That's what your gas meter is measuring it in. The average home in a cold part of America uses about 1,000 therms every year, and that would add up to about 13,000 pounds of CO2, more than your car in a lot of cases. So again, we have to think about electricity and transportation, but also the energy used within our buildings, often as natural gas or heating oil, in order to tackle climate change. So that's why building efficiency matters so much. A lot of buildings are still too inefficient. They leak heat out, they pour heat in during the summer. We can make buildings really much more efficient. We can always build new green buildings, of course, but we're going to have to do a lot to retrofit the hundreds of millions of buildings that already exist. Then we got to shift to new energy sources that don't burn fossil fuels to heat our homes, cool our food, and give us nice hot showers. And we've got to pay special attention to the refrigerants in air conditioners and freezers and refrigerators. Because when those leak, they become a kind of super pollutant, causing disproportionate climate change. When we look here, we see energy efficiency, shifting energy resources, and addressing refrigerants are going to be the crucial aspects of buildings in climate change. Let's wrap up here. Now we've got the last sector, which is everything else, the other category, about 10%. A lot of this is from the energy sector itself, when they flare off natural gas in an oil well, or what are called fugitive emissions, which are kind of the emissions that escape accidentally from a fracking well of natural gas, or a coal mine, or a leaky natural gas pipeline. These are things we should demand the energy industry address right now. These are super low-hanging fruits that if the energy industry cared at all about this, we could shut off like 6% of climate change today. So what have we learned? We've learned that attacking the sources of greenhouse gases are the first biggest step to addressing climate change. And there are big 5 areas we should be focusing on: electricity, food, industry, transportation, buildings, and so on. And we can see those here. But then inside those major sectors, we have hundreds of little areas that are all really important to address if we want to solve climate change. There's absolutely no silver bullet here. We do a lot of individual things between flying and cement and plastic, electricity and buildings and food and meat and everything else. All of those little things contribute to climate change. So we're going to have to do a lot of little things together to solve climate change. There are many sources, therefore there are many solutions. We're not going to solve climate change simply with a solar panel, or by eating less meat, or not flying, or not using cement. We've got to do a little bit of all of that stuff. And usually, one of the repeating lessons we saw here is start with efficiency. Wasting less energy, wasting less material, wasting less food. Those are all really crucial. And then switching what we do to something that doesn't emit greenhouse gases. We can still make electricity, but do it differently. We can eat food that doesn't emit greenhouse gases. We can make stuff and live in places and get around without any fossil fuels at all. So between efficiency, where we usually start, and transforming the economy to a low carbon economy, we have some great solutions to tackle climate change. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how we can address climate change by looking at the sinks of greenhouse gases, and also how changes in society can have secondary benefits to climate change. As we think about these issues, one of the best places to begin is supporting nature's carbon cycle. These are things that are naturally sinks of greenhouse gases today. If we zoom in here, we can see how forests and oceans are absorbing over 40% of the pollution we put in the atmosphere every year. Most of that in the form of CO2. And so if we can support those sinks and make sure they stay healthy, that would help us address climate change into the future. But the problem is some of these systems aren't that healthy right now. A lot of our forests are feeling the weight of climate change already, or are being torn down. And our oceans are getting warmer and more acidic, and they're also getting more polluted and over-harvested at the same time. So job number one here is just kind of support nature, give it some backup, and make sure that it isn't diminishing these sinks we already have. Later, hopefully we can augment those sinks by putting other land and other ocean systems into production and add to what nature's doing already. But here's the math we got to start with. 100% of these emissions are coming from us. Land is putting out about 24% or removing it and putting it into our forest. The oceans are pulling out about 17% of the greenhouse gases and putting it into different parts of the ocean. Interestingly, even though oceans cover a lot more of the Earth's surface, they actually take up less of the carbon than land does. Oceans are important, but forests are kind of a big story here. Altogether, that still leaves about 59% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so this is part of the solution, but it can't be the whole solution. And before we look at the individual sinks, there are about 4 major points I think we have to talk about before we even get started. First of all, it is crucial that we give nature support because nature is already doing 40% of all the removal, and we're doing zip. So starting with backing up nature, giving it support, and making sure we don't lose that service of removing greenhouse gases is crucial. Then once we kind of get that stuff secured, we can also maybe add some of our own new carbon sinks, like planting new trees or farming new areas in different ways, or maybe machines that pull carbon out of the atmosphere, all of that. But first, why don't we help out nature that's doing a good job already? The second thing to remember is sinks all have limits. You can't take an infinite amount of greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere. There's no way. Trees only get so big. Soils only go so deep and can have so much carbon in them. Coral reefs can only grow so fast. So we have things that have a limited capacity to absorb our greenhouse gases. That's why it's probably more important to stop them before they ever get in the atmosphere than try to remove them later. And that leads to a third point. Sinks take time to absorb greenhouse gases. If you put out a ton of CO2 today and plant trees to offset that, it might take 100 years for those trees to grow fully to maturity, absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere. But in the meantime, you've got 100 years of climate change caused by the pollution you started with. So you can't really get away with this. By planting trees to offset emissions introduces a time lag where climate change is just going to be worse. There's kind of an asymmetry here. Turning off a power plant stops pollution today. Planting trees or building coral reefs or whatever basically is a solution for 50 to 100 years from now. The other thing we have to worry about is sinks may not always be permanent. They might not be secure. For example, some of our sinks are biological in nature, growing a new tree, putting stuff in the soil, putting stuff in a kelp forest or whatever. Those are biological sinks and they're great. They can also be reversed. We can plant trees and then they could be burned down. We could farm really well and build up the soil, but that farmer retires, the next one comes in and plows it all up and it goes back in the atmosphere instantly. So these kind of biological sinks can sometimes be quite ephemeral. They may not be permanent. But some sinks might be more geological in nature. If we can lock up carbon in kind of like a rock or something like a coral reef or down in the basalt or something like that, then we got something that's locked up pretty much permanently, at least on human timescales. So let's look at these sinks one by one. On land, again, it takes up about 1/4 of our emissions, which is pretty amazing. And it's doing it with photosynthesis. The natural vegetation of our planet, especially trees, are growing a little bit faster now, and they're accumulating more biomass, or essentially wood. And when those things die, they build up a little more carbon in the soil, what we call soil organic matter. So photosynthesis, biomass of the living stuff, and soil organic matter, that's where all the carbon goes. And we can help maintain those sinks in nature by leaving nature alone. We can first take pressure off of nature by not clearing forest, for example. And that's where food waste and diets and things like that, where we don't need to grow more food and invade those forests because we're more efficient with the food we already grow. That'll be crucial. But also putting up kind of big protections around the remaining rainforest and peatland forest and other ecosystems to make sure they're never cleared at all. And then once we've kind of taken care of nature and secured it, then we can do exciting things like putting our farmland into new types of agriculture that might absorb carbon, what we often call regenerative agriculture. So we looked at these solutions. We looked at food waste and diets, not by just reducing emissions, but preserving sinks. We looked at how protecting forests didn't just reduce the deforestation emissions, it kept the forest sinks intact too. Then we looked at how changing agriculture, degrading lands back into production and reversing that can be really important as well. One of the things I want to mention, though, is regenerative agriculture is getting a lot of attention these days. This idea that farms and ranches can be farmed differently to absorb carbon. That is true. There's a lot of great evidence showing that we can grow crops and livestock in ways that can actually absorb carbon, whether in trees, in the forested areas around the farmland, or in agroforestry, or in the soil itself. And that's really exciting. But there are limits to how much this can happen. There's only much soil you can build up, there are only so many trees you can build up, and they are all kind of temporary. The next farmer or a drought or a fire could disturb all of them, putting them back in the atmosphere. So be careful there. There's also a few groups that are not really paying attention to the science, I would say, that are making big, bold claims that regenerative agriculture can absorb all of our greenhouse gas pollution. That is just not true at all. The scientific community is quite clear that it is a solution, but it's one of many solutions, and we've got to make sure we balance it with all the others. So when we look at the numbers, we see that protecting ecosystems and reducing food waste, kind of protecting and taking the pressure off of ecosystems, is critical here to preserving sinks. And then we can put the farmlands and the degraded lands into better systems of agriculture so they absorb carbon too. So this combination of kind of taking pressure off of land, protecting it, and then farming or working lands in different ways can be powerful ways to maintain and enhance land-based carbon sinks. The oceans are kind of different. We don't manage the oceans as much as we might on land. A lot of it's out in the open ocean where we don't do so much. Coastal oceans are another matter, though. But either way, oceans as a whole, even though they take 71% of the planet, absorb 17% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And they do it through three major mechanisms. One is what we call a solubility pump. That's just a fancy way of saying CO2 dissolves in water. And what's interesting here is that salt water dissolves CO2 just like fresh water does. But as water warms up, it absorbs a little less CO2 than cold water. So as the climate changes, we can't really expect the solubility pump to get bigger. It's probably going to stay where it is or maybe go down a little. Then we have something called the carbonate pump, which is where living animals pull carbon dioxide and calcium out of the seawater and they use it to build a shell. Our shellfish, things like oysters and clams and mussels, but also crabs and lobsters. They pull that stuff out of the water and build shells that stay there for quite a long time. Corals are the same thing too. Remember, corals are animals. They're not plants, they're not rocks. They're little polyp animals that build a calcium carbonate shell around them that we call a coral reef. And that takes CO2 out of the water as well. And then we finally have the biological pump, which is just basically the plants of the ocean. The little tiny microscopic phytoplankton and diatoms that do photosynthesis, as well as what we call macrophytes, or big plants, like kelp forest. They do photosynthesis, they build bigger plants, and those plants will later die and get buried in the ocean's sediment. So all of those things, whether it's just chemistry, building shells, or growing plants, pull carbon out of the air, through the water, and tuck it away. We can do a little bit to help already, obviously. For example, protecting the coastal ecosystems from being developed or torn apart, like mangroves and wetlands and marshes are critical carbon sinks. But also, they turn out to be really helpful in protecting our storm surges on the coastline. When we have healthy mangroves and coral reefs and marshlands and wetlands along the coast, we don't have as much flooding or as much damage from storms. So it kind of helps us prevent climate change, but also adapt the climate changes already here. That's a good win-win in my book. But we might also be able to add new carbon sinks out in the ocean, maybe through farming kelp in big regenerative aquaculture systems, or maybe planting new coral reefs and oyster beds and lots of other things. We're just beginning to explore the possibilities here, and I think they're going to be really cool. So we looked at land and oceans, but then we could look to machines to maybe become carbon sinks. There are machines out there, kind of in laboratory settings and a few very small pilots. The atmosphere is not noticing these things at all yet. They're way too small. But the idea here is maybe we could build machines that would pull carbon out of the atmosphere and either store it down in the rocks somewhere or tuck it away and lock it up, or use it for something. That's the one that gets me really excited. If we could pull carbon out of the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or whatever, and use it to make plastics or jet fuel or other things society might want without using oil at all. Use pollution to make our stuff, not new oil. Leave the oil in the ground, we'll take the old stuff out of the air. That would be really cool. This is nowhere near being deployable right now, but some of these technologies are very interesting, and over the next 10 years or so, I think we're going to see a lot more rapid development of these technologies, and they may start to play an important role. So we've looked at the carbon sinks, and before that, the carbon sources. And we can see by reducing pollution, working with nature, and maybe augmenting nature, we've got a lot we can do about climate change. But there's a third principle too, that improving society, not because of climate change, but because it's the right and moral thing to do, turns out to be a great set of climate solutions. It's kind of interesting. And turns out improving equality and equity, especially with women and girls, for example, improving the access to education and healthcare helps women and girls see new opportunities around the world. And as a consequence, women and girls will have maybe fewer children, but healthier children a little bit later in life than they might have otherwise had. And when that's the case, the growth of population in the future might bend down earlier than we thought before. While population growth actually isn't really responsible for most of climate change, most of the emissions are from rich people, not poor people. Future population growth slowing down will actually help us a little bit in the long run as population growth and economic development drive up emissions in the future. So this is a great win-win. By helping women have new opportunities, we might actually help the environment and the climate as well. So it turns out that helping people, for lots of good reasons, actually can help us with climate change as well. And this represents kind of a win-win opportunity to improve human well-being as well as improving our future climate solutions.
Along with 11 other mothers from around the globe. So this is a pretty exclusive club here. So she has a background in communications, and Winona sees climate art and storytelling as regenerative practice, a way to make connections with each other, create meaning in our lives, and envision an equitable and livable future. And she is very expert in how to talk about climate and how to have climate conversations. She'll speak about that and several other climate solution subjects.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction. I'm Winona, and I'm so happy to be here. I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to meet everyone yet, and I hope we can visit a little bit once this is over. So here's why we're here tonight. It's our big, beautiful planet. It's our home. It's a shared home. Us and all the other creatures live here. It's important for our lives. It's important for our families. And it's what gets me up every morning. That our beautiful earth, all the creatures, and my 8-year-old daughter are why I'm here and doing this work. I don't know if I'm an expert in anything. I'm an expert in love for life and love for the planet, love for my kid. And that's what gets me up. That's why I'm doing this work. I just got back from spring break. I was in Utah, and southern Utah, and the sun was glorious and the wind was blowing hard. And my whole trip, I was like, wow, there's just money falling on the ground. Resources, energy, possibility, gifts from our universe to us. And it's just all I could think about when we were driving along and trying to get to our next spot. And that's really, for me, the takeaway from the Project Drawdown videos. I've read a good chunk of the book as well. That's really the takeaway, that we really have almost all the solutions we need to tackle this crisis. And that's amazing that we have all these solutions and to save our home. So when we think about these solutions, we wonder, well, why aren't we implementing them quickly? As some of you know, the IPCC just released their third report for this year. It's a third in a series of reports. There'll be a fourth in the fall. That'll kind of be a synthesis. But that just came out. And that's their takeaway too, that we have all the solutions we need to address the crisis. Here's some tweets. I'm on this global list. I get information like the hot off the presses, what you should tweet when the IPCC reveals a report. I didn't tweet this today because I'm off of Twitter for my sanity, but new IPCC climate report, reaching the Paris targets is still possible, but climate action needs to scale up and speed up starting now. We need all the things: rapid cuts, phasing out fossil fuels, doubling renewables, increasing climate finance. This is a call to action for governments and businesses to act on the science, act on the solutions, have emissions by the end of this decade, and achieve net zero by 2050, all while increasing funding for adaptation. Waiting is not an option. Urgent. Carbon offsets are not a real climate solution, according to this report. Yet many net zero pledges focus almost entirely on offsetting rather than reducing emissions. The report warns offsetting is not the answer and strongly emphasizes the need for rapid and deep emissions cuts now. Next slide. And here's the big takeaway. Unless emissions are cut faster than governments currently plan to, we will miss our window to achieve the Paris Agreement, and climate impacts will accelerate. Unless governments act faster than they currently plan to. So we have all the solutions we need to address the climate crisis. We've just learned that from these videos. How are we going to ensure that emissions are cut faster than governments plan to? What are we going to do? I look every day to the All We Can Save accelerators, Shape Culture, and I know you read All We Can Save as part of your book club, correct? This is up on my wall in my office. It's handwritten out, it's printed out. I can see it from everywhere I sit in my office. Because like I said, I'm just a mom. I have an 8-year-old. I love communications. I would rather garden than host a rally at Northwestern Energy like I did last week. That would be my preference, but this is what I'm doing because I have to be able to look my kid in the eye 8 years from now when she's 16 years old and said, I worked my butt off and did all I could. So I look at these accelerators: Shape Culture, Build Power, are number 1 and 2. Shape Culture, Build Power, okay? Set goals. We have a bunch of goals. We know what the goals are, right? We know where we need to go. Alter rules and policy. We've been pounding on that. We're trying to do that. It's super important. All of these are important. Shift capital, yes. Change behavior, yes. Improve technology, yes. Shape culture, build power. Those are 1 and 2. What in the heck are those and how do we do it? Is a question. Are you okay? Okay, down the wrong pipe. All right, so these are the 2 I come back to because I have a degree in biology, but I'm not a scientist, an acting scientist. I'm not an elected official. I'm not a lawmaker. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a mom, okay? Shape culture, build power. You can go. So as far as I can tell, based on the data that I've looked at, as far as what people think about climate change and how climate change is impacting people across the country and in Montana, we have a lot of people out there who are probably worried about the issue and are being impacted, right? Shape culture, build power. We have these big divisions though, right? In our culture, in our power, we have all this dividedness. And that's understandable. There are a lot of moneyed interests, I would say, people with power who, if we're divided, it works out better for them. But here's just one piece of data. Counties that had a heat wave in 2021, Pretty, I mean, in the West, it's just like solid red, right? And most of us can remember that from last year. It was brutal. Go ahead. Next up are going to be a series of slides, hopefully, from the Yale climate opinion maps. How many of you have seen these before? Yale climate opinion maps? Okay. These are amazing maps to spend some time with. There's a lot of different questions you can take a deep dive into, and they go all the way down to the county level, I believe. They go down to the state level for sure, and I think the county level. So we're going to go through a series here. Estimated percentage of adults who think global warming is happening. National average is 72%. If you dive down into Montana, it's, as my grandpa would say, pert near 72%, maybe 71, but just about 72%, tracking with the national average. Next slide, please. Estimated percentage of adults, rather, who think global warming will harm future generations, 71%, about the same if you drill down to Montana. Estimated percentage of adults who think global warming will harm plants and animals, 71%. Go ahead. Estimated percentage of adults who think global warming will harm people in the US goes down a little bit, 64%. Now what we're going to see over these this slide and the next slide are what we call psychological distance to the issue. Okay, Katharine Hayhoe talks about this a lot. This is where I get kind of this line of reasoning. I have to give her credit because she's an amazing leader. Next slide, please. Estimated percentage of adults who think global warming will harm them personally. Estimated percentage of adults who hear about global warming in the media at least once a week. It's only 33%. Harm personally was only 47%. Now, this is the kicker. Go ahead, for me. Estimated percentage of adults who discuss global warming at least occasionally. National average in Montana is about the same, 35% of people. So we have a bipartisan problem with talking about the greatest existential threat that humanity has ever faced. So why do when I think about what I can do as a mom and someone who opens her mouth about climate a lot, why do I look at shape culture and build power? That's because it's a place where we don't have a lot of solutions, right? Or we're not doing necessarily a lot of work. It's getting better. I mean, media coverage is, we see some increases around big problems that happen, but our culture, we're not talking to each other. Now we're all talking because we're in the midst of it, right? We're in the thick of it. We have a group that we're a part of. We talk about it probably every day, but most people, including lots of people we know, aren't talking about it. And as Katharine Hayhoe points out, if we won't talk about it, we won't care about it. And if we don't care about it, we're not going to change it, right? So when we're talking about implementing solutions, shaping culture is one of the very first steps. And one of the very first steps in that is having a conversation and having regular conversations in uncomfortable places. And I don't even remember what's next. Go ahead. Okay. So this is tied in. So an overemphasis on personal responsibility. So my group doesn't, someone is like, oh, do you encourage people to recycle and change light bulbs and all that stuff? And I'm like, go Google, personal actions for climate change and you'll get that, right? That's all there. But this overemphasis on personal actions in some ways is, been driven by the fossil fuel industry and has certainly benefited the fossil fuel industry because people have become so focused on like what they can do, easy actions you can take at home. These, of course, are extremely important and they are part of the overall solution, but they've kind of become our focus. And now we're trying to shift it, moving from kind of that personal action focus to collective action for ending fossil fuels. Next slide. As Bill McKibben said in a piece in the last couple of years, we're way past the point you can make the math work one Prius at a time. So I think my mantra in the most recent years has become the most important thing an individual can do is to be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to make change. Okay, so our primary focus for our group is that we must shift from personal actions to connection with other people and collective efficacy. Now, you can pause there for a second. We have this handout tonight, 8 ways that Montanans can engage on climate. The first one is to find a community of people to support you and get involved there. The second is talk about climate change regularly. If only 35% of people nationally and statewide are talking about it, we have a problem for building broad support for implementing solutions. We have a big problem. Think about the last election, no matter a federal election, no matter what side you were on, everybody was talking about it. Nobody was talking about anything else. And look at the turnout on election day. So if we're going to turn this ship around and we're going to take on the greatest existential threat humanity has ever faced, we need that solid, cold, quiet blue to turn bright red, right? That's what we need. So talking about it is super important. And then there's a whole other list. And on the talking about it tip, let me recommend Katharine Hayhoe's TED Talk, which there's a link on here. Or there's a link off our website, you can get to it. We also hosted her last April, almost a year ago, to give a Montana talk, and it was amazing. She was great, and that's also on our site. So let me recommend those for tips about how to have those conversations, and also a panel that we hosted in February. There's a recording on our website called Having Climate Conversations Across Differences, and I thought it was pretty powerful. There's some good things and worth watching. So I'm not going to take a deep dive on that stuff tonight. What I really want to point out is as we're thinking about these amazing solutions from Project Drawdown, as we're talking about the speed with which we need to implement them coming off the latest IPCC report, we have to radically rethink how we're engaging as people who are already engaged in the climate movement. Next slide, I'm not sure what it is. Okay, here's how I think about it. As a mom, an activist, and as someone who has a lot of climate conversations, many with people who don't always want to have them, we must connect effectively in order to shape culture and build power and ensure a thriving world. We need to become skillful, dedicated communicators in all spaces. Nearly all spaces. There's definitely some conversations that aren't going to work. So let me just say, there's definitely some people you probably can't have a conversation with. But it's really a small percentage. We need to reach out actively across most, not all, differences, cultivating our compassion and our commitment to de-escalation. Internet memes. We all need our private groups who we can joke with. Goodness sakes, we need those. But internet memes, yelling, anger, divisiveness, we all participate in that from time to time. Maybe not all of us, most of us. I do too. I mostly debrief with my husband when I have those moments. But these are really important skills. We need to connect on shared values and build trust. Katharine Hayhoe's talks address that. We must talk directly about climate impacts in the context of our shared values. In Montana, 71 to 72% of the people can have a conversation about climate change. I know it's popular to say that we can't mention climate change in Greater Montana. I don't buy it. I think we can. We just need to learn how to communicate and stay engaged across difference. We must talk directly about climate impacts. I just read that one, sorry. Our goal with every climate conversation must be simply to have another conversation. Our goal is not to win. Our goal can't be to shame somebody, to convince them of the facts. Our goal needs to be to stay connected. Because right now we're all operating, many of us anyway, are operating as if we don't need our neighbors. Oh, they're those people. They believe that, and I'm over here, and I'm with these people. I put myself in this too. I mean, all of us. and it's just what's going on in our culture right now. And we have to confront that separation head on, because the concern about climate, the understanding is 72% in our state and our country. It's there. We have to find a way in to connect across what we perceive as these really strong differences. We'll see what's next here. So my last slide. We must cultivate vulnerability in ourselves, courage, and I would say love, in the service of connection to save our shared future. And that's a tall order, but I think we're going to need it, because no matter if we're talking about mitigation or adaptation and getting through the coming challenges, we are going to need our neighbors. And we are going to have to figure out how to take, as my grandma would say, well, just take a pan of brownies and go say you're sorry. We're going to have to figure out how to do that. Of course, there are people that won't work with, of course, but let's not focus on them. Let's focus on the 72% of people who understand it's happening. And yes, we all suffer from some psychological distance. Like even my brother, he said the other day, oh, I'm pretty sure that right here where we are is going to be just fine. And I didn't burst his bubble. I just said, you know what, I just really love you. And let's, I'll see you this summer. We'll talk about that then. Some of the culture shifting, this is what I have to say about shaping culture and building power, because if you want to get solutions implemented and you want, or if someone said, how do we get the right people elected? I was like, well, if we can't talk about climate, we can't get the right people elected. If we can't even do that, how are we going to get people who care about climate elected, right? So I think those conversations are just really crucial. Other things that we can do is putting climate in, sorry, I'm moving around maybe a little too much, putting climate into public spaces in creative ways. So one of the things we did is we started montanaclimatestories.org. It's mtclimatestories.org. You can go on there and read climate stories of all kinds from all kinds of different Montanans. We started a magazine called The Changing Times. It's printed on recycle. Well, this one isn't. We just shifted to recycled. It took us a minute to get access to that. And this is an intergenerational magazine responding to the climate crisis. There are stories. Here's a story, Choked Up, a Montana climate story. And it's about a mom talking about momming last summer with her 2 little kids and reflecting on that. Sometimes there's poems and art from kids. There's a kids corner saying about how to engage appropriately with children to get them engaged with nature or activism, depending on their age. And there's people like Allison DeJong writing about, we can all be those people. We can put solar on our houses. Maybe not everybody, but many people. So this is one of the responses we have. And now this is in 15 communities outside of Missoula, including Hamilton. And people can subscribe and get it from home. I'm not pitching that. I'm just saying it's possible, but we also deliver them for free in 15 communities, in bookstores, coffee shops, and libraries. So it's putting, and almost every single library we called was like, yes, send us that magazine. We'll put one in our periodical section and we'll hand them out. So conversations are happening. So I've talked too much. Let's open it up for discussion. I was nervous about that, and then now I'm nervous about getting other people talking. So, yes, I can. I guess I'll take questions. Okay. Yes, sir.
You spoke a little bit about the reports and I think it's fair to say there's an extraordinary gulf between bringing messages as this stuff, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And amongst the lack of direction that we're getting from this so-called global leadership, is quite honestly, I'm to the point where I think we don't have a clue. Seriously, because they cannot address the problem in a way that makes sense to anybody outside of their community. And because you're familiar with the reports, I really just wanted to have your kind
Right. So you're saying there's a disconnect between the wonkiness of like the IPCC report and maybe how I'm trying to talk about climate to just a general audience. Like, yeah. It's really hard. I mean, they're trained as scientists and yeah, it's wonky. And they, I don't work with the IPCC, so I'm not an expert. But I mean, I don't read 3,000 page reports. I read the summary usually and like the reporting, right? Even with a science background, I don't take that deep dive because, well, mostly I don't have time. I have an 8-year-old. She was just home 2 days sick, so. Sure, yeah.
What you're talking about is scientific.
Mm.
Broke down in numbers with your graphs.
Right.
There is a probability assessment that can, the ability for people to connect with the subject.
Yep.
And without that,
Yeah.
there is no chance at all that anything's going to happen. Yet, you're bringing us that message. Nothing originated in Glasgow or Paris or IPCC.
Right. Well, I would say there are people probably they're doing it. Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who is a climate scientist, she's one of the authors of the US Climate Assessment, very respected climate scientist and a masterful climate communicator. And I would recommend to your book club Saving Us, which is her new book. I don't get a kickback, so I'm not promoting it because I'm getting funding from Catherine Hayhoe, but it's an amazing book about communication. And that's why I brought this message tonight, because I was like, well, I could do a rundown of these little, these actions that we have. Like you can watch a really good divestment webinar on our website about how to divest your IRA and your, all those things. We have that. That's an important action for people with means to take, certainly. But I agree, I agree with you that that isn't coming through. And for our group, when I was, discovered Catherine Hayhoe's TED Talk, I was like, wait a minute, this is huge. And I had walked through the Yale maps independently of her, and she walked right through the Yale maps. Just went ahead, and I was like, yes, this is really important information that we need to be sharing, that people aren't talking about it. And I think it's I think part of it is, as one mom said to me, I feel like I have the information, but I don't have the agency, right? I don't know what to do. And just seeing that one of the most important things we need to do is making connections. We need to build connections between people and communities in a collective manner is so important. So I guess I'm agreeing with you. And that's why I decided to talk about this tonight instead of like the things we kind of emailed about. I just was like, I think this is a really important piece of it that you're right, isn't presented there. So I don't know what that helps with, but I agree with you.
Well, I think that in itself is a message that's worth spreading. Because honestly, being somebody who's been involved in this actively, then I'm just to the point where that's the only thing I think you can push up to legislators and law. You can't push up to these people who claim themselves on the subject. And I take Project Drawdown to task for being very much of the same ilk. That it doesn't work that way. It works the way you're explaining. It works the way
Yeah.
this natural harmonic society that we are engaged in. We sit on our ass at home. Still, that's
right.
So I think that pushback, even if Project Drawdown, is like get off that. Because quite frankly, what really works is people working.
Well, and I think there, to be fair, I hear you saying about like pushing back towards Project Drawdown and these other experts, but they're just doing what they know how to do. And in some ways, maybe this is a next phase, or maybe it should have come with it. I don't know. I've got engaged when I got engaged. So, I'm just at where I am at in my own journey as an advocate. But I think we need all this information. It's really crucial. And solutions, and using solutions in your conversations with people, especially who aren't engaged, which are most people, The one piece of data I didn't share that'll even kind of rock your world more is that only 24% of people nationwide are actually engaged in activism around this issue. And that seems like a lot. And that could just be people signing petitions, right? I'm sure the people actually doing like hands-on stuff is even smaller, despite broad awareness. Okay, other question.
Well, I appreciate the point. I just wanted to enlarge a little bit on Catherine Hale's message.
Yes, please.
She's really saying our leaders, governmental leaders and so on, don't feel they have any mandate because nobody is talking about it.
Right.
We have to build the culture.
Yes.
Right. Talking about, she talks about colleague of hers who likes to play ice hockey, and all the ponds aren't freezing. So the scientists would talk to these guys about climate change and what's slipping away. And I feel we need to be able to talk about what we love that is slipping away. I like to drink coffee. It's slipping away. So until we have that collective will to talk about, tell our elected officials something must be done, they won't do it. They're just too many other pressures. So that's why we're doing this, folks. We have to, all of us, put activists on the list.
And even just good neighbor. I mean, to just, so you're just kind of, recapping kind of Catherine Hayhoe's model. I mean, it's pretty simple. It's connect around a shared value, tell a personal story or stories. You're probably having multiple conversations about why you're worried, get informed about how the climate impacts are impacting the shared value, whether it's ice hockey, birding, skiing, gardening, hummingbirds, bees, whatever it is. I'm just like in the garden apparently. And then have a conversation around that topic and share those concerns. And with the goal of trying to stay connected as the goal, not trying to win in one conversation. And I just look at it as like like learning how to be good neighbors again, right? To some extent. Yes.
So, I want to say too, when I think about having kind of conversations, which don't come easy for me, they're very hard, but I'm learning to say things. But also, I just think about having climate conversations with people in power. So like, just for example, I put our senator, our representative, our city council, our county commissioner, I put Bob Rowe from Northwestern Energy and the Valley Electric. And so, I mean, part of when I think about having conversations, letting people know in corporations and businesses and power what I think, because we hear that we don't hear enough about it. So I just, as I was typing up that list, I was thinking, well, what if 50 or 100 Bitterroot Valley people sent a postcard to Bob Rowe from Northwestern Energy and said, we want more renewables and we want to change that we're offered in terms of our, I mean, it's not going to change the world, but it's going to, maybe there would be some change that happens as yes, I think we need to talk about neighbors, yes, we need to talk about our family, and we need to talk about power in whatever ways we're able to, where we stand. 71.
Yeah, and we need to talk to our friends and family and neighbors to build that support and bring more and more of them with us as we talk to leaders. And that is how we apply that pressure, I think. Other questions? Yes.
I'm afraid that part of the problem here is that, 72% of everybody, they buy into this. And so, what is the problem? Well, it's all this talk. Talk. We're not talking about anything. We're talking about something that everybody agrees about. And everybody just hears, it's
so we're talking about, let's talk to the politicians and get them to do it. Let's talk to the power companies and get them to do it. But there are things that we can do right here in Bitterroot that can actually have real impact. We have hydropower generation possibilities. We can be producing hydrogen to run fuel cells for our schools, for this school. This school, the roof of this school should be covered with solar panels. The roof of our high school should be covered with solar panels. And so we need to talk to people about doing a thing, not just talk to people about, hey, climate change is scary, horrible things are going to happen. You know, you know, all of these things, there are things that you can actually do, and you can do them right here in the valley.
And you can.
And there's a lot of funding available for doing these things right here in the valley. And I don't know how many people are familiar with who Buckminster Fuller is, but Buckminster Fuller talks about being a trim tab, right? And so a trim tab is a very small device on the very back of a giant rudder on a boat. And the trim tab is used to move the rudder. And so you can move this very small device, and that applies pressure to that device, and it moves the whole rudder. And so when we're talking about this stuff, we need to talk about doing a thing. Not talk about talking about doing a thing, but find a thing, do it. And do it at a scale that makes sense to a community. Because the simple truth of the matter is, if everybody in the Bitterroot Valley wrote a postcard to, you know, Senator Daines, it wouldn't do shit. And pardon my French, that's actually an English word. But, and so I think there's a lot of things we can do right here in the valley to execute on a lot of climate solutions that will make our communities better.
I think that is like so powerful, talking about focusing on talking about doing a thing and a project that's going to save money, empower the community, create independence, all these things that are going to be probably shared values for a lot of people in the community. I fully support that. And I think the focus on solutions is correct. I will say that it will make having those conversations around those shared values easier if you have a solution that's tied into the conversation that people can focus on, either one they can engage in or you can engage in together on a community level. And it brings in that bigger scale change that we need to move towards, and not just, I mean, yes, change your light bulb, super important. I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying I'm probably not going to talk about that as much as like talking about a community or a statewide solution that we need to get behind. So I agree with that. Yes.
I talk to a lot of folks around here, you know, about the climate situation. Global warming and climate change are kind of trigger words for a lot of people.
Yep.
So I approach it as an evolving climate. You can't call it anything but that. Yeah, they say one of their biggest things is, well, yeah, the globe warmed before, and there was climate change before. Yeah, it was evolving, that's right. But the big difference is, there were 1 billion people on Earth in 1800, and there's 8 billion now. And there wasn't 10,000 years ago when you're talking about the climate changing and evolving or freezing or getting warm. So evolving climate is the terminology I use. I don't say the global is warming, I don't say it's climate change, it's evolving. That's pretty hard to deny. I'm a rancher, I've lived here for 70 years. And so I've seen it firsthand. I'm not talking because I read books or films or whatever.
Yeah, totally.
But that's a big step right there.
Yep.
That I figured out finally how to take when I'm talking to you.
That's great. I mean, that's the thing. You know, we have conversations with people, we have to make evaluations about what we want to get out of it. Like, do we want to stay connected to them? Well, if they're our neighbors and our friends in a community, probably, yeah, we do. And like, B, do we want to just like be right in the conversation, or do we want to have an effective conversations that's going to keep them engaged? And effective conversations, and that's why I think I put effective in there on one of the slides, we want to engage effectively. And when you have to figure out what that is for different groups of people and different individuals, it's really important. It's hard work.
Climate has evolved here in the last some years in a drastic,
Yeah.
not good.
Yeah, it's warming up quickly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's accelerating. We all can see it.
Evolving, but not in a good way.
Yeah.
That's conducive to water, life, vegetation, animals, whatever.
Growing hay. Yeah.
Here knows that's the truth. They have to know.
Yeah.
I talked to my neighbors who are ranchers. And so we need to get some of the ranchers together and talk about this. What's your name?
Jeff.
Jeff.
Goose.
Hi, Jeff. Rick Donovan. Hello.
Long time no see.
Yeah, we've been up here.
Well, I'll tell you.
Well, this is getting real social.
I've been ranching most of my life.
Yeah.
I also worked off
I thought I recognized you.
for the DNRC and also the U.S.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
Okay, good. I don't need to stand up here too long, but I don't want to like drag it out, but. Okay.
How do you function when somebody presents to you or somebody in your group that climate change is really going to require us to lower our quality of life, or climate solutions, not climate change, but climate solutions will require us to sacrifice, to forego, that things will, there's just no way we can consume the message we're consuming and address the problem. So how do you, or does it even come up?
Well, I have kind of two reactions to that. I mean, yes, I think for me personally, just as a mom, or an advocate, and what I understand, like that resonates for sure. But I also think like we're not, there's this other whole picture to paint. I was raised by my grandparents, but so I have these kind of like World War II like things swirled into my consciousness from my grandparents. But like, I think people miss connecting with their neighbors. I think they miss more local, community-oriented kind of engagement. I think there's a lot about how life is, how fast it is, how people feeling overwhelmed by stuff. I think there's a lot of things that when people slow down and reflect, they're questioning or they're exhausted by. I mean, I think as advocates that we could do a better job, and certainly the people with the solutions could do a better job of kind of painting the picture of like what transforming our society looks like, because of course that is a little bit scary, and thinking about losing things is going to be scary for people. So I think thinking about how things improve, whether it's your soil, having more water on your property, to being more connected locally with your neighbors and friends and communities, driving an electric car. I mean, those cars are more fun. My husband is a builder, and he just ordered one of those fancy Ford electric trucks for his business, and he's super excited. You know what I mean? And that was a big investment for him. Like, he went out on a limb, but he's excited. So I think part of the stories we need to tell, to engage, to reach out. We need to tell the story of a solution that we're going to work on in our community that's going to galvanize people. I mean, working to put solar panels on the schools, like raising money to do that and having that happen. Man, you have the whole town talking about solar, just like you have the whole town talking about Bitterroot College right now, right? So,
The whole town isn't talking about it.
oh, maybe they're not. Okay. Well, that's all I've seen or heard about since I got here. No. Okay. Well, anyway, but if you had a big project that was gonna, different problem. Okay, that was gonna like solve a cut costs for the school, or what have you. That could really galvanize people. Anyway, I'm kind of off topic, but I don't know that I hear that a lot. But I grew up in a really small town in North Dakota, and change was hard for people. I think, even living in a big city, I know North Dakota, don't hold it against me, but change is really hard. And I think being sensitive to that and being able to talk about the benefits of the change, certainly if we don't change, we're going to lose a lot of things.
Change is going to happen
Either way, it's going to happen. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm going to officially call us done. Winona's got a long drive home, and we've already gone over time. But you know, this building is open, I think, until 9 o'clock. So just because we officially end, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to stop talking. But anyway, thank you, everyone. And 2 weeks from tonight, across the street again, back at the Daily Leach community. And that will be our last one. So thank you, Winona. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
And have a good evening.